The ballroom of the Marina Bay Meridian did not glitter so much as it breathed light. Glass constellations hung from the ceiling, refracting gold across polished marble and the silk shoulders of people who moved as if the future belonged to them. Outside, Singapore's harbor shimmered in disciplined lines, cargo ships waiting their turn, the quiet machinery of global power at rest. Inside, capital wore the language of salvation. Climate resilience, someone was saying near the Champagne Tower. Equitable infrastructure. Emerging markets with moral yield. Words that sounded like promises. Words that Ava Brooks had once believed could build a just world, before she learned who usually owned the microphones. At the center of the room stood Daniel Whitmore, tall, composed, the kind of American confidence that translated easily across borders. His tuxedo was perfectly cut, his smile calibrated for cameras and ministers alike. When he laughed, people leaned in, not because the joke was good, but because proximity to certainty had always been a currency. Tonight he was announcing Whitmore Global's new $2 billion climate infrastructure fund, the largest private vehicle of its kind in Southeast Asia. A decade in the making, the press had said. A vision only he could execute, the article in the Financial Herald had declared, beneath a portrait that had carefully framed his jawline against a skyline at dusk. Beside him stood Lena Hartman, pale gold dress, platinum hair drawn into a smooth architectural knot, one hand resting lightly at his wrist as if she had always belonged there. Power couple, a journalist whispered into her recorder. Transatlantic climate royalty. The orchestra softened as the moderator stepped onto the stage. Conversations fell into elegant murmurs. Waiters paused mid-step. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, a habit Ava once recognized as his private metronome before every major deal. He raised his glass. "Tonight," he began, voice carrying with the warm authority of someone who had never been interrupted, "we celebrate not only capital, but conscience." The doors opened, not abruptly, not dramatically. They opened with the measured hush of a space that understood timing. And the room, this room that had seen sovereign wealth, political revolutions disguised as partnerships, billion-dollar handshakes, did something it had not done all evening. It stopped. Ava Brooks stood in the doorway. For a moment, no one moved, because recognition is slower than memory and faster than breath. 5 years earlier, her name had vanished from the same networks now praising Daniel's genius. 5 years earlier, her departure from Whitmore Global had been described as a strategic transition, then as a conflict of vision, and finally, in the smaller, crueler circles, as proof that brilliance without diplomacy could not survive at scale. 5 years earlier, she had been erased with the efficiency of a line item, and now she stood framed by light as if the room itself had been waiting to remember her. Her dress was midnight, not the theatrical kind, but the precise darkness of deep water. Long sleeves, clean lines, no jewelry. She did not glitter. She did not need to. Her hair, natural and unforced, curved around her face with the quiet authority of something that had never been designed for approval. In one hand, she held nothing but a slim black portfolio. In the other, her phone, dark and unconsulted. She looked, not at Daniel, but at the stage, at the screen behind him where the title of the evening glowed in restrained typography. Future of Climate Capital, keynote session. There was a shift then, subtle but irreversible. A diplomat from Nairobi straightened. A venture partner from London whispered a name. A young policy analyst, too new to understand the old scandal, searched her tablet and went suddenly still. "Ava Brooks," someone breathed. The sound traveled the way truth travels in rooms built on reputation. Softly, then all at once. Daniel's glass tilted in his hand. It was the smallest movement, almost elegant, the crystal catching light like a blade. Lena felt it before she saw it, the change in the orbit around them. Her smile held, but its wattage increased, the way one does when cameras are still watching, and something unplanned has entered the frame. Ava stepped forward, not quickly, not slow, with the calm cadence of a woman who had long ago stopped measuring her worth by how others received her. The event coordinator reached her first, voice pitched too high with surprise. "Miss Brooks, it's an honor. Your flight, we weren't sure you'd—" "Impact matters more than arrival," Ava said gently. Her voice was lower than people remembered, warmer, carrying not because it demanded attention, but because it had learned how to hold a room without asking permission. And the irony, exquisite and unspoken, settled over the tables like a second tablecloth. Because the keynote speaker for the summit, the architect behind the Lagos Coastal Defense Initiative, the woman whose climate data model had just been adopted by 3 governments Daniel had spent a year unsuccessfully courting, was Ava Brooks. The program in every guest's hand said so. Daniel saw it then, not her. The line beneath her name, founder, Equinox City, the competitor his analysts had warned him about. The firm that kept winning deals in regions his fund had labeled too complex. The firm he had tried twice to acquire and had been refused with polite, unyielding language. The room began to turn, not physically, gravitationally. People who had been angled toward Daniel found their bodies reorienting in the direction of the doorway, as if some unseen force had recalibrated the geometry of importance. Ava accepted a glass of water from a passing waiter. Her fingers were steady. Her gaze moved once across the room, not searching, not avoiding, simply taking inventory. When her eyes met Daniel's, it lasted no longer than a breath. No accusation, no nostalgia, recognition. The kind you give a city you once lived in and have outgrown. She inclined her head, a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for courtesy. Daniel felt it like judgment. The moderator cleared his throat, uncertain for the first time all evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice finding its way back through the altered air. "Before Mr. Whitmore's announcement, we have the privilege of welcoming our keynote, a woman whose work is redefining climate capital for the next generation, Miss Ava Brooks." Applause began, scattered, then gathering, then rising into something genuine and unpracticed. Daniel lowered his glass. For the first time in years, he was no longer the center of the room. And Ava moved forward through the aisle as if she had never left. Not returning, reclaiming. Outside, the harbor lights continued their disciplined shimmer, indifferent to the rearrangement of human hierarchies. Inside, the air held the electric stillness that comes when a story people thought was finished begins again. If you've ever walked back into a place that once tried to define your ending, if you've ever felt the quiet power of becoming someone your past could not predict, stay with this story. Tell me in the comments, is closure something we find or something we build? And if you believe in women who rise without asking for permission, follow the journey of Ava Brooks, because this is only the moment the room stopped breathing. The real reckoning has not even begun. 5 years earlier, Washington, D.C., the night everything was first taken from her, without anyone raising their voice. Washington, D.C. had a way of making ambition look like destiny. In spring, the city softened. The marble steps warmed beneath the sun, magnolia petals gathered along the edges of fountains, and every reception, whether in a think tank's glass atrium or a townhouse on Embassy Row, carried the faint perfume of policy and possibility. It was in one of those rooms that Ava Brooks first learned how easily a future could be narrated into existence. They had met at a climate finance roundtable, the kind where junior analysts spoke in careful sentences and senior partners listened only when the numbers promised leverage. Ava had been invited because her urban climate risk model had begun circulating through academic networks like a rumor that refused to fade. She arrived with a borrowed blazer, a laptop that hummed when it overheated, and the quiet certainty of someone who had spent her entire life translating survival into systems. Daniel Whitmore arrived as if the room had been built for his proportions. He spoke last, without notes, turning regulatory frameworks into something that sounded like momentum. When he smiled, the older donors leaned forward. When he referenced emerging markets, the younger associates took out their phones to record him. Ava watched him the way she watched data, searching for pattern, not charm. Afterward, he found her standing alone near the catering table, studying the conference slides that no one else had bothered to read. "You're the only person who didn't clap," he said, not offended, only curious. "I was checking your numbers," she replied. He laughed. Not the public version, but something brief and startled, as if no one had spoken to him without first calibrating admiration. "And?" he asked. "You're underestimating flood risk in Tier 2 cities by about 30%, she said, tapping her screen, "which means your infrastructure timeline collapses in 8 years instead of 15. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like that. Later, he would tell people it was her brilliance that drew him. Later, he would tell Ava it was her refusal to perform. At the time, it felt like recognition. They began to move through the city together. Morning briefings where she rewrote his models over black coffee. Evening receptions where he introduced her as the mind behind the metrics. Long walks along the Potomac where they spoke about capital as if it were something that could be taught to behave ethically. He took her to a dinner at the Meridian Club. Dark wood, silver service, portraits of men whose names had become policy, and watched the way she shifted the conversation from returns to resilience without ever raising her voice. "She sees risk the way others see opportunity," he told a senior partner, pride threaded through the sentence. Ava believed him, not because she needed his validation, but because for the first time her work moved at the speed of power. He had access, she had architecture. Together, they looked inevitable. By the time Whitmore Global opened its climate infrastructure division, their photographs appeared in industry newsletters with a caption that would follow them for years: "Capital and Conscience." The power couple. Their apartment in Georgetown was all glass and pale wood, overlooking a narrow street that turned gold at dusk. On Sundays, Ava spread her data projections across the dining table, while Daniel cooked with the focused seriousness of a man determined to master something domestic. "You make everything sound like a strategy," he teased once, sliding a plate toward her. "Everything is a system," she answered, not looking up. He kissed her temple, a gesture that would later become his signature in photographs, and said, "We're building something no one else has." It felt true. In boardrooms, they moved in practiced synchrony. Daniel translated her analytics into language investors trusted. Ava recalibrated his timelines into structures that could survive beyond press cycles. Deals closed. Articles appeared. Her models reshaped portfolios that had previously dismissed urban climate adaptation as charity. His name led every headline. At first, she did not notice, because in private, he always turned to her. "What do you think? Run the scenario again. Tell me where the risk really is." And when the firm celebrated its first billion-dollar commitment to resilient infrastructure, he lifted his glass and said, in front of the entire division, "None of this exists without Ava." Applause rose. Cameras flashed. Later, when the article was published, the quote was shortened. "Whitmore leads new era in climate capital." Her contribution appeared in the 7th paragraph, beneath a photograph of Daniel framed against a skyline. "It's just media," he told her that night, loosening his tie, the city flickering behind him. "They need a face." "Recognition matters," she almost said. But there were other moments. A conference panel where her analysis was introduced as supporting research. A donor dinner where she was asked how she balanced work with Daniel's schedule. A strategy session where a junior associate repeated her recommendation and received immediate approval. Each time, Daniel's hand found the small of her back, warm and reassuring, as if the gesture could compensate for the shift in gravity. "You know what you mean to this firm," he would murmur later. "You don't need their applause." And she believed him because believing was efficient. Because confronting the discrepancy between private acknowledgement and public credit would have required dismantling the architecture they had built. Their love, if that was what it was, thrived in the language of shared ambition. He called her his compass. She called him her amplifier. They began to appear on panels together, the firm's preferred narrative. He spoke in arcs. She spoke in structures. Audiences leaned forward for his certainty, and stayed for her precision. "You make me better," he told her once in the back of a car, leaving a summit in Toronto, the city lights dissolving into rain. "You make me visible," she answered, meaning it. For a while, the equation held. They moved through airports and ministries and investment forums as if they were a single entity. Two halves of a future that publications described as unstoppable. In photographs, Daniel always stood half a step ahead, his hand extended as if guiding her forward. It looked like partnership. It felt like momentum. It became myth. What Ava did not see, not yet, was how carefully the myth had been constructed, how the firm's communications team positioned him at the center of every frame, how donors directed questions to him even when she had spoken last, how her work became the invisible scaffolding beneath his narrative. In the apartment, at midnight, she still built the models. He still asked for her projections. He still said, "we." And because love and ambition often wear the same vocabulary, she mistook proximity for equality. Outside, Washington continued its patient choreography. Sirens in the distance, motorcades slipping through intersections, the low hum of decisions that would shape cities she had never seen. Inside their glass-walled living room, Ava stood one evening, watching her reflection merge with the lights of the Capitol. Behind her, Daniel's voice drifted from the study as he spoke to investors in London. "Yes," he was saying, calm and certain. "We built the most advanced climate risk platform in the sector." "We." She closed her eyes, letting the words settle over her like a promise she had not yet learned to question. The myth of the power couple was not a lie. It was an arrangement of truth, selective, polished, and luminous, that made two people look like one unstoppable force. And for a time, Ava lived inside it as if it were a shared future rather than a story already being told in someone else's voice. The first time Ava realized something had been taken from her, nothing was missing. Her laptop was where she had left it. Her access badge still opened every glass door in Whitmore Global's climate division. Her name remained on the internal directory, spelled correctly, title unchanged. On the surface, her life continued with the same calibrated efficiency. Morning briefings, model revisions, policy calls that stretched across time zones like taut threads. But there are losses that occur not in objects, but in attribution. She noticed it on a Tuesday. The weekly strategy meeting had begun as it always did. The long walnut table, the screen glowing with projections. Daniel at the head of the room with his sleeves rolled to the precise point that suggested both effort and ease. Ava sat 2 seats to his right, her laptop open, the climate risk simulation she had spent 6 months refining, ready to be unveiled. It was her most ambitious framework yet, a predictive model that layered infrastructure fragility, migration pressure, insurance volatility, and municipal debt into a single adaptive timeline, a system that could change how capital moved. She had walked Daniel through it the night before in their apartment, her voice low with the quiet exhilaration that came only when an equation resolved into something larger than itself. "This," he had said, leaning against the kitchen counter, eyes bright in a way she loved because it meant he understood. "This is the future of the firm." He had kissed her then, slow and certain. "We present it together," he had promised. Now the screen shifted. Her model appeared, not the early version she had circulated internally, the final one, the one she had not yet uploaded to the shared drive. The room leaned forward. Daniel began to speak, not translating her work, not framing it, but narrating it as if the architecture had originated in his mind. "The key," he said, pacing slowly, "is to stop treating climate exposure as a static variable. We built a dynamic system that recalibrates municipal risk in real time." The word landed with its familiar warmth, and for a moment, Ava did not move. He moved through the model with confidence, his hand gliding across the air as if drawing the equations himself. He used her language, not the simplified version he preferred for donors, but her exact phrasing. Adaptive debt corridors. heat-indexed migration flow, infrastructure latency curves. Each term, a fingerprint. She waited for the moment he would turn, gesture toward her, say her name. It did not come. Questions rose around the table. Daniel, how soon can we deploy this? What's the capital threshold? Can your team run a pilot scenario for Jakarta? He answered smoothly, referencing late nights and iterations, speaking of the system's evolution in a tone that suggested solitary authorship. Ava's hands remained still on the keyboard. Across from her, a junior associate, new, eager, glanced at her with the brief uncertainty of someone who sensed a discrepancy but did not yet understand the hierarchy that would erase it. The meeting ended in a swell of approval. A partner clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "This is why we brought you in to lead this division," he said. "Brought you." As if the work had not existed in Ava's mind years before Daniel ever learned the vocabulary of urban climate debt. As if she had not been the one to map the cities investors refused to see. Later, in the corridor, Daniel caught her hand. "That went well," he said, voice low with adrenaline. "They loved it." "You presented my model," she replied, not accusing, not yet. He paused, only a fraction too long. "Our model," he corrected gently. "We've been building this together from the start." The corridor hummed with passing analysts and the distant sound of an espresso machine. Ava searched his face for the private expression he wore when they were alone. The one that admitted vulnerability, that recognized her as origin rather than extension. Instead, she found the public version, composed, persuasive, already moving toward the next conversation. "You know how these rooms work," he added softly. "They needed to hear it from me to move this fast." Needed. The word wrapped itself in logic. He leaned closer, his hand warm at her waist. "This gets us the capital. Then we scale it your way." Her way. Future tense. The architecture of postponement. That night, in their apartment, the city lights scattered across the windows like data points. Ava reopened the model. Her code had been accessed at 3:12 a.m. She had been asleep beside him at 3:12 a.m., her head resting against his shoulder, his breathing steady. She did not remember him leaving the bed. The realization was not sharp. It was slow, like water seeping into a foundation. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated. A donor briefing where her projections appeared in Daniel's deck before she had finalized the variables. A white paper circulated to the board with his name listed as primary author and hers in the acknowledgement. An interview in Global Finance Review in which he described his team's breakthrough methodology. His team. He still came home late and asked for her input. He still lay beside her in the dark, his arm draped across her waist, saying, "Run the scenario again. I trust your instincts more than anyone's." In private, nothing had changed. In public, everything had shifted. The theft was not visible because it was occurring in the space between those two realities. She began to notice the language of meetings, how often her ideas were introduced by him before she could speak. How often partners looked to him for confirmation after she presented. How frequently the communications department requested his presence for panels that had been built on her research. "You're the engine," he told her one night, when she finally allowed the silence between them to carry weight. "I'm just the interface." It sounded like devotion. It functioned like extraction. "Recognition matters," she said then, the words she had swallowed months earlier, returning with a calm she did not entirely feel. "It will come," he answered, brushing his thumb across her cheek. "Once we close the Singapore deal, your name will be on everything." Singapore. The future. Always the next milestone, the next justification, the next moment when balance would be restored. Ava wanted to believe him because the alternative required acknowledging a fracture in the system she had mistaken for partnership. At the firm, Lena Hartman's arrival was announced as a strategic expansion of the communications arm. Young, precise, fluent in the aesthetics of influence. "She'll help translate the work for global audiences," Daniel said over breakfast, scanning his phone. Translate. The word lingered. At the next press shoot, Lena stood between them, adjusting the angle of Daniel's tie, asking Ava to shift slightly to the side so the composition would feel cleaner. In the published photograph, Ava appeared half a step behind. The caption read, "Daniel Whitmore and his climate innovation team." She looked at the image for a long time, not because she did not recognize herself, but because she did. The posture, attentive, supportive, brilliant. The woman who built systems and allowed others to narrate them. The invisible architecture. The theft, she understood then, was not a single act. It was a sequence of permissions. Each small compromise entered into the ledger of partnership. Each delayed correction. Each moment she allowed logic to override instinct. By the time she recognized the pattern, the narrative had already been written. Daniel was the visionary. She was the force behind him. Ava closed the article and returned to her model. On the screen, the cities she had mapped, Lagos, Jakarta, Miami, pulsed with projected futures, their timelines adjusting in response to variables no one else had thought to measure. The work remained hers. The origin point had not changed. But in the world that converted ideas into power, authorship was not determined by creation. It was determined by who stood at the front of the room when the screen lit up. And for the first time, Ava allowed herself to see that the system she had built with Daniel had been designed, deliberately or not, to make her indispensable and invisible at the same time. The most elegant form of theft, because nothing had been taken that could be returned. Only the story of who had made it. The office had always been too transparent for secrets. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped around the corner suite of Whitmore Global's climate division, turning the city into a shifting backdrop. Sunrise gilding the Potomac, evening traffic threading red and white through Georgetown's narrow streets. Ava had chosen the space for its light. She believed work done in full view carried its own kind of integrity. "You'll need a room that signals authority," Daniel had told her when the firm first expanded the division. "You're the one building the intellectual spine." At the time, she had laughed at the phrase, but she remembered the way he watched her when she stood at the window. The faint pride in his eyes, as if her presence confirmed something about his own trajectory. The first months in that office had been a season of clarity. Whiteboards filled with evolving systems. Maps layered with data that no one else knew how to read. Late nights when the cleaning staff moved around her with quiet deference because they had learned she would still be there when the elevators went dark. Her work had weight there. Her voice had direction. So when the email arrived, short, efficient, routed through HR, she read it twice before understanding its language. Reallocation of executive workspace to communications lead. New office prepared on 14th floor. Reallocation. The word was bloodless, almost polite. She did not mention it to Daniel that morning. He had already left for an early investor breakfast, the scent of his cologne still lingering in the apartment like an unfinished sentence. At the firm, the glass office door was open. Inside, someone else stood at the window. Lena Hartman. In daylight, she was more precise than Ava remembered from the press photographs. Not soft, not ornamental, but composed in a way that suggested years of understanding how to be seen. Her suit was ivory, cut close to the body, the kind of tailoring that required no introduction. On the desk lay a tablet, a leather portfolio, a small arrangement of white orchids that had not been there the day before. For a moment, Ava thought she had entered the wrong room. Then Lena turned. "Dr. Brooks," she said, voice warm with practiced familiarity. "I hope you don't mind. Daniel said you'd already been briefed," Daniel said. The phrase carried the quiet authority of decisions made elsewhere. "This space works better for external meetings," Lena continued, gesturing lightly toward the city beyond the glass. "Communications needs a visible axis. Symbolism matters in global capital." Symbolism. Ava looked at the whiteboards. Her equations had been erased. Not partially, not carelessly, but completely. The surfaces wiped clean to a reflective sheen. The maps were gone. In their place hung a large digital display showing a looping video of Whitmore Global's recent projects. Solar grids in Morocco, coastal barriers in Rotterdam, Daniel standing at a podium in Singapore, his name appearing in clean white typography. It was the first time Ava understood how a space could be repurposed, not only physically, but narratively. "This used to be my office," she said. Lena tilted her head, not dismissive, not apologetic. "Of course," she replied, "and your work here has been extraordinary. But the firm is entering a new phase. Daniel believes your team will benefit from being closer to the modeling unit." Your team. Down 2 floors. Interior. No windows. The demotion was architectural. "I'm sure you'll make the new space your own," Lena added, the sentence shaped like a kindness. Ava noticed then that Lena's tablet displayed a document, the draft of the upcoming Singapore keynote. The title read, "Whitmore Global, Designing the Climate Resilient Future." Author, Daniel Whitmore. Ava's model was the core of the presentation. Her language threaded through the paragraphs, refined into a cadence she recognized as Lena's work. Persuasive, elegant, accessible. The two of them had already begun to translate her systems into something that no longer required her presence. "You've done remarkable things here," Lena said softly, following Ava's gaze. "Now the world needs to understand them." Understand, not know their origin. That afternoon, Ava moved her things herself. No announcement, no assistance. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt longer than its physical distance. Her new office was smaller, enclosed by matte walls, the air faintly cooler. The window faced another building, a grid of identical panes reflecting a sky she could no longer see directly. She set her laptop on the desk. For a moment she stood without sitting, as if waiting for the room to reveal its logic. Daniel called an hour later. "Have you seen the changes?" he asked, his tone careful, almost casual. "Yes. It's strategic," he said. "We need Lena at the front of the narrative. Investors respond to clarity of message." "And my work?" Ava asked. "Your work is the message," he replied. "Nothing changes where it matters." Where it matters. The phrase hovered between them, weightless and absolute. That evening, he came home later than usual. He kissed her as he always did, at the door, at the curve of her shoulder, but his mind remained somewhere else, moving through schedules and announcements. "She's effective," he said while loosening his tie. "Lena. She understands how to scale influence." Ava watched him. In the lamplight, his face still carried the version of him she had fallen in love with. The man who had once listened to her speak about flood corridors as if they were poetry. "Do you?" she asked quietly. He paused. "Do I what?" "Understand how to scale influence without rewriting where it comes from." He crossed the room, hands settling at her waist, the familiar gesture that used to dissolve every fraction. "You're not being erased," he said, voice low with conviction. "You're being protected. The politics at that level, they're brutal. Let me take the front." Protected from visibility, from authorship, from the narrative she had built. Later, lying beside him in the dark, Ava replayed the image of Lena standing at the glass, not as an intruder, as someone who had been invited, someone who belonged to the future the firm had chosen to present. In the weeks that followed, the shift became aesthetic. Lena moderated the panels Ava had designed. Lena introduced Daniel using the language Ava had written. Lena occupied the space that had once translated Ava's work into power. The firm's website changed. A new photograph appeared on the homepage. Daniel and Lena in the glass office, the city luminous behind them. The caption read, "Leadership for a New Climate Era." Ava scrolled through the page, her name appearing lower, beneath a section titled Research and Analytics. Her title remained the same. Her proximity had changed. At the next executive reception, she watched from across the room as Lena adjusted Daniel's cufflinks before he stepped onto the stage. The gesture intimate in its efficiency, not romantic, strategic. They moved together with the seamless choreography of people who shared the same narrative. For the first time, Ava understood that the displacement was not about a room. It was about visibility, about the axis around which power arranged itself. She had built the architecture. Lena had been given the glass. And Daniel had chosen which of those two things the world would see. That night, alone in her new office, Ava turned off the overhead lights. In the darkened screen of her laptop, her reflection appeared, faint, superimposed over the model she was still refining. The cities pulsed beneath her image, their futures adjusting in silent equations. Her work remained intact, but in the language of influence, it had been relocated to a place without windows. The woman in the glass office had not taken anything from her. She had simply stepped into a story that had already begun to move Ava out of the frame. There are evenings that begin like any other. Calendar notifications, polite laughter in hallways, the low hum of elevators carrying ambition between floors. And yet later, when memory returns to them, they glow with a different gravity. The partnership vote was scheduled for 7. Ava had known the date for months. It had lived in the margins of her notebooks, in the quiet tightening of Daniel's voice whenever the subject of long-term structure came up, in the way senior partners began to include her in conversations about expansion as if the outcome had already been decided. "You're the obvious choice," one of them had told her at a reception, his tone warm with the ease of someone who assumed merit moved in straight lines. "No one understands the climate vertical the way you do." Obvious. She had learned to distrust that word. Still, she allowed herself the smallest architecture of hope. Not for the title, not for the office, but for authorship, the public acknowledgement that the systems she had built were not auxiliary, not support, but foundation. The firm had reserved the top-floor conference room for the vote, the one with the long table of dark glass, and the view that turned the city into a field of light. Ava arrived early. The room was empty, the chairs aligned with ceremonial precision. On the screen, her name appeared in the agenda beneath Daniel's. Partnership confirmation. Climate division. She set her portfolio on the table and walked to the window. From this height, Washington looked almost abstract. Monuments reduced to geometry, traffic to threads of red and white. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the email that would be sent afterward. The quiet congratulations, the subtle shift in how her voice would be received in rooms that had always required translation. The door opened. Daniel stepped in, phone still in his hand, the afterglow of a call lingering in his expression. "You're early," he said, smiling, crossing the room to kiss her cheek. "So are you," she replied. He adjusted his cufflinks, that small private metronome. "You'll be brilliant," he said. "They already know what you've done." No. The word had once been enough. The partners arrived in measured intervals, dark suits, familiar nods, the scent of expensive restraint. Lena entered last, not as a voting member, but as communications lead. Her presence justified by the firm's new emphasis on narrative continuity. She took a seat along the wall, tablet poised. The meeting began. Formalities first, minutes, quarterly projections, the ritual language of governance. Then Daniel stood. He spoke of growth, of expansion into Southeast Asia, of the Singapore fund that would redefine Whitmore Global's position in climate capital. He spoke of the division as a unified structure, a system that had evolved under his leadership into something unprecedented. Under his leadership, Ava felt the phrase settle into the room like a new piece of furniture, solid, difficult to move. He moved through the milestones. The early research phase, the initial investor skepticism, the breakthrough model that had shifted their risk framework. Her model, her nights, her cities. He did not lie. He simply narrated. And in that narration, authorship migrated. When he finished, the senior partner at the head of the table folded his hand. "Daniel," he said, "your vision for this division has transformed the firm." Vision. The vote for his partnership was unanimous. Applause, restrained, dignified, moved around the table. Daniel sat. Ava's name remained on the screen. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the same senior partner cleared his throat. "Dr. Brooks," he began, the tone shifting into something carefully neutral. "Your contributions to the analytical framework of the climate unit are, of course, exceptional. Of course, a prelude to distance. However, at the partnership level, we must consider not only intellectual capital, but alignment with the firm's collaborative culture." Collaborative. Ava did not move. The words continued, measured, almost kind. "Concerns have been raised regarding your independent operating style." Independent. as well as your reluctance to integrate communication strategy into your presentations. Her insistence on accuracy had been reclassified as resistance. We believe, he concluded, that the division will benefit from your continued leadership at the director level. Director, the title she already held. No promotion, no vote. The screen shifted. Her name disappeared. In its place appeared the next agenda item. No one looked at her. Not out of cruelty, out of institutional grace. This was how exclusion occurred in rooms that prided themselves on civility, without confrontation, without raised voices, without any moment that could be pointed to as violence. The meeting moved on. She listened to the discussion about expansion as if from a great distance, the language dissolving into sound. Daniel did not look at her. Not once. Afterward, people gathered their portfolios with the soft efficiency of those accustomed to decisive evenings. A few offered brief touches to her shoulder. "You're invaluable," someone murmured. "We'll revisit this next year," another said. Next year, the most elegant postponement. Lena approached last. "I'll make sure the external messaging reflects your importance to the division," she said gently. Importance. Ava nodded. She left the room before Daniel could reach her. The corridor was empty, the glass walls reflecting her figure in diminishing repetitions. In the elevator, her reflection looked unchanged. Same navy suit, same composed posture, as if the architecture of her life had not just shifted. Outside, the air had cooled. The city moved as it always did, indifferent to the rearrangement of private hierarchies. Her phone vibrated. An email from communication. Subject, leadership announcement, immediate release. She opened it. A photograph of Daniel at the glass office desk, the city luminous behind him. The headline, Whitmore Global Names. Daniel Whitmore, partner to lead climate expansion. The text spoke of his pioneering vision, his strategic foresight, his ability to integrate data, capital, and narrative into a unified future. Her name appeared in the 8th paragraph. The firm also recognizes the analytical contributions of Dr. Ava Brooks and her team. Analytical contributions. She stood on the sidewalk, the light from passing cars moving across the screen like water. A second email arrived. Internal. Short. Efficient. Following the restructuring of the climate division, Dr. Brooks will transition to a senior advisory role focusing on model development. Transition. A demotion without the language of demotion. She did not realize she had stopped breathing until a pedestrian brushed past her and the world rushed back in. When she reached the apartment, the lights were off. Daniel had not yet returned. She moved through the room slowly, touching nothing. On the dining table lay the draft of the Singapore keynote. Her language, her systems, the architecture of her work, all now framed within his narrative. She closed the file. On the kitchen counter sat 2 glasses and a bottle of wine, unopened, the celebration he had planned for an outcome he had known in advance. Because he had known, he had adjusted his cufflinks with the calm of certainty. He had said, "You'll be brilliant," as if brilliance were the metric. Midnight passed. He called once. She did not answer. At 1 in the morning, another email arrived. From HR. Subject, access update. Her partnership level credentials, the ones she had been using for months in anticipation of the vote, had been revoked. The system had been updated at 7:42 p.m., the exact minute the room had applauded Daniel. Ava sat at the dining table, the city's light moving across the glass. The theft of authorship had been gradual. The displacement from the glass office had been symbolic. This was final. Not a removal of her work, not a dismissal, an erasure from the narrative of power. Her laptop chimed again. A message from a junior analyst sent in confidence. "I'm sorry. It wasn't about collaboration. The decision was made last week." Last week. Before the meeting, before the speeches, before the pretense of deliberation, Ava closed the laptop. In the silence of the apartment, she understood with a clarity that felt almost serene that the myth of partnership had ended long before the vote. Tonight had only formalized the disappearance. She rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the city that had once felt like an extension of her ambition. In the glass, her reflection remained, unchanged, not erased, only removed from the story that had tried to contain her. Behind her, the unopened wine waited on the counter, a celebration for a future that had never been intended for her. She left it there, and for the first time since she had entered Whitmore Global, she allowed herself to imagine a world in which her work did not require permission to exist. Detroit did not ask who you used to be. It did not care about your bylines, your keynote introductions, the polished language of rooms where water was always poured before you had to reach for it. It did not lower its voice when you entered. It gave you weather. It gave you distance. It gave you long streets where the past stood in brick and broken signage. And the future, if it existed, had to be built without an audience. Ava arrived in late November, when the sky had already begun its winter habit of closing early. Her apartment was on the third floor of a building that had once been a hotel. The radiator spoke in metallic sighs. The window looked out onto a parking lot where a single street lamp hummed all night like an unfinished sentence. The first evening, she unpacked only what she needed: laptop, 2 notebooks, a kettle. She placed them on the narrow table that served as both desk and dining space. In Washington, she had lived in glass and light. Here, the walls were matte, absorbing sound. For the first time in years, there were no meetings to prepare for, no decks waiting for translation into the language of capital, no calls that began with, "Daniel will join in 5 minutes." Silence. It did not feel like peace. It felt like altitude sickness, the body struggling to adjust to an air without recognition. The consulting firm she contacted replied with polite distance. "We've decided to move forward with candidates whose profiles align more closely with our current needs. Your experience is impressive, but we are seeking a more collaborative leadership style." The language traveled across industries with minor variations. The reputation Whitmore Global had given her, brilliant, difficult, independent, had arrived before she did. Her savings were finite. She sold the Georgetown apartment share without returning to see it. The funds transferred into an account that now existed without the reassuring scale it had once carried. By January, she was taking short-term contracts, not strategy, not design, data cleaning, municipal spreadsheets for a Midwestern insurance broker that did not know or care that she had once modeled climate risk for sovereign funds. She worked in a co-working space above a shuttered retail store, the air smelling faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink. Around her, freelancers spoke in soft, practical voices about deliverables and payment schedules. No one recognized her. The first week, she kept expecting someone to. A glance held too long. A double take. A hesitant Dr. Brooks? It never came. The anonymity was not an insult. It was a removal. In the evenings, she walked. Detroit in winter held a different kind of architecture. Warehouses with their windows punched out, murals blooming across the sides of buildings like declarations that refused to fade, the river a sheet of dark metal separating one country from another. She learned the geography of grocery stores that stayed open late, the laundromat where the dryers rattled like old trains, the library that kept its lights warm even when the snow began to fall. Her phone grew quiet. The invitations stopped first. Panels, round tables, donor dinners, replaced by newsletters she no longer opened. Then the messages from colleagues shifted from, "We should talk," to, "I hope you're well." Finally, even Daniel's name disappeared from her notifications. Not because he stopped moving through the world, because she stopped searching for evidence of it. There were nights when she lay awake listening to the radiator's uneven rhythm and replayed the last meeting, the vote, the language of collaboration, the email that had transformed her into an advisory function. The mind, deprived of forward motion, returns to old equations. What if she had spoken sooner? What if she had insisted on authorship? What if she had left before the narrative closed? Regret was a system with infinite loops. One morning, in February, she opened a data set for the insurance broker, flood claims across small municipalities along the Great Lakes, and something in the numbers refused to remain administrative. The pattern was wrong. Not the claims themselves, but the intervals between them. The recovery time. The municipal debt spikes that followed each event, she began to map them. Not for the contract, for herself. She pulled public infrastructure reports, census migration data, the fragmented climate projections that no one had bothered to reconcile because the cities were too small to attract capital. The model began to take shape the way all her systems did, slowly, then all at once. Not the global scale she had worked on before. Something more granular. A framework for cities that had been excluded from the language of resilience because their returns were considered insufficient. She worked at the narrow table until the radiator fell silent and the room cooled around her. The anonymity became an advantage. No communications department, no board oversight, no narrative, only architecture. In March, she took a train to Cleveland to meet a municipal planner who had answered one of her cold emails. They spoke in a cafeteria that smelled of overcooked vegetables, the planner's coat still on because the heating system had failed again. "We don't need a billion-dollar fund," the woman said, pushing a stack of budget documents toward Ava. "We need a way to survive the next storm without losing half our housing stock." The clarity of it, the absence of performance, felt like oxygen. Ava rewrote the model for cities like this, not as charity, as systems that could be financed if the metrics were recalibrated. She began to understand that exile was not only distance from power, it was distance from distortion. In Washington, her work had been translated into the language investors found palatable. Here, it could remain in its original form. By April, she had her first independent contract. Small, a regional coalition of Midwestern cities pooling resources for a shared resilience fund. They could not pay what she was worth. They paid on time. The email confirming the agreement arrived at 6:12 a.m. She read it 3 times before allowing herself to believe it. There was no applause, no press release, only a line in the document, Principal Architect, Ava Brooks. Her name at the top, unmediated. She went out that morning before the co-working space opened and walked along the river. The ice had begun to break, the surface shifting in slow, deliberate fractures. On the opposite bank, Canada was a blurred outline. For the first time since the night of the vote, she felt something that was not loss, not triumph, direction. Exile had taken everything that had once signaled her importance. The office, the title, the proximity to capital. It had left her with the origin. Her work, her mind, the architecture she had built before anyone knew how to value it. In the weeks that followed, she stopped checking the industry news. She stopped measuring her progress against Whitmore Global's announcements. Her days filled with data sets from cities that had never been mentioned in the rooms she used to inhabit. Flint, Gary, Toledo, places where climate resilience was not a conference theme, but a question of whether people could remain in their homes. The scale was smaller. The impact was immediate. One evening, as the sun set behind the parking lot and the street lamp flickered on, she opened a new document. Not a model, a structure, a firm, a name that did not require translation. She typed slowly, the letters appearing on the screen with the quiet inevitability of something that had been waiting for this distance to exist. Equinox Cities, a system for the places capital had learned to overlook. She sat back and watched the names settle into the center of the page. In Washington, her identity had been braided into a partnership that had defined her visibility. In Detroit, she existed without reflection. No glass office, no public narrative, only the work in the cities that needed it. Exile had not diminished her. It had stripped away the story that had made her invisible inside her own creation. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, deliberate, covering the parking lot in a clean, unclaimed surface. Ava closed the laptop and stood at the window. For the first time in months, she did not feel as if she had been removed from the future. She felt as if she had stepped outside a system that had never been designed to hold her, and in the quiet of that separation, begun to build one that was. The first time Ava heard his voice, it did not arrive with authority. It arrived with a question. Did you design the Cleveland resilience model? The email had been brief, almost austere. No title in the signature that announced its own importance. No list of affiliations that needed to be decoded. Just a name, Julian Mercer, and a request for a call that could be scheduled Whenever your time is protected enough to think. Protected enough to think. She read that line twice. In the architecture of her previous life, time had been segmented into performance. Calls stacked like polished stones, each one requiring a version of her calibrated to its audience. Here, in Detroit, her hours were her own, yet still fragile, still being negotiated with rent, invoices, and the quiet discipline of rebuilding. She replied with 3 available windows. He chose the earliest. The call connected at 7 a.m. when the city outside her apartment was still undecided between sleep and movement. The radiator clicked once, then fell silent, as if it too wanted to listen. "I've been studying your municipal framework," he said, and his voice carried neither flattery nor urgency, only attention. "You've shifted the risk index from asset value to displacement velocity. That's unusual. Unusual. Not impressive, not innovative, not the vocabulary of rooms that required enthusiasm as currency. A recognition of structure." "Yes," Ava said, her own voice still adjusting to the idea that it did not have to perform. "Because the real loss isn't property, it's continuity." There was a pause. Not the pause of someone waiting to speak, the pause of someone thinking. "Exactly," he said quietly, "which means most of the current investment models are measuring the wrong outcome." She leaned back in her chair, the first small ripple of something she had not allowed herself in months. The alertness that comes when a mind meets another mind, moving at the same velocity. They spoke for 40 minutes about secondary cities that never appeared in global funds, about the politics of infrastructure financing, about the way resilience had been aestheticized into panels and white papers while the actual work remained unfunded. He did not interrupt. He did not reframe her conclusions into his own language. He followed them to their natural edge and asked what lay beyond. When the call ended, she sat for a long time with the quiet hum of the laptop fan and the afterimage of the conversation. It had been, she searched for the word, clean, no extraction, no subtle repositioning of credit, just 2 people mapping a problem. The second email arrived that afternoon. "I'll be in Chicago next week for a foundation review. If you're willing, I'd like to meet in person. Not for a pitch, for a conversation that doesn't fit on a call." She almost said no. Exile had taught her caution with new alignments. Partnership had once been a language of erasure, a way for her work to be absorbed into someone else's visibility. But there had been something in the precision of his questions, the way he had said continuity as if it were a principle rather than a talking point. She booked the train. Chicago in early spring held the kind of wind that made even tall buildings seem temporary. They met in a cafe that had the undecided atmosphere of a place that had once been something else. Exposed brick, tables that did not match, light falling in diagonal planes across the floor. Julian Mercer looked exactly as his voice had sounded. Mid-40s, white, unassuming in a way that suggested he had long ago stopped using appearance as a form of negotiation. His suit was well cut but unbranded, his watch practical, his posture the relaxed stillness of someone who did not need to occupy space to be present. He stood when she approached, not performatively, as if it were the only possible response to her arrival. "Dr. Brooks," he said, and the title did not carry hierarchy, only accuracy. "Ava," she corrected gently. "Ava," he repeated, as if placing the name in its correct coordinates. Over coffee that neither of them finished, they spoke without the scaffolding of a formal agenda. He told her he had spent the last decade structuring philanthropic capital for Midwestern foundations that had grown tired of funding projects that produced reports instead of change. "We have money," he said, almost with irritation. "But the models we're offered are designed for scale that doesn't exist here." "And scale," she replied, "has been mistaken for impact." He smiled then, the first visible shift in his composure. Not charm, not performance. Recognition. He had read everything she had published under Whitmore Global. Not the press releases, the technical appendices, the sections no one quoted. "You were building this even then," he said, tapping the edge of her printed framework. "You just didn't control the structure." The sentence landed with the gentle precision of a diagnosis that did not seek to wound. Control, not credit. Control over the architecture of what she made. I don't partner anymore, she said, the words emerging before she could soften them. I'm not asking for one, he answered. No defense, no persuasion. Then what are you asking for? A way to deploy capital that follows your model, he said, without changing it into something legible for people who will never set foot in those cities. She studied him then the way she had once studied contracts, looking for the clause that transferred power away from its apparent center. I don't need to be visible in it, he added. My work is making structures function, not being associated with them. It was such an unfamiliar statement that for a moment she did not know how to respond. In Washington, visibility had been the currency that determined influence. Here was a man offering capital that did not require her to diminish the system she was building in order to accommodate his name. Why? She asked finally. He considered the question as if it deserved the same care as the models they had been discussing. Because I've spent 15 years funding ideas that were more concerned with who stood at the podium than with what changed, he said. And I'm tired of outcomes that look good in annual reports and do nothing in the neighborhoods they're supposed to serve. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass. Inside, the space between them held a stillness that was not awkwardness, but calibration. Two people measuring whether trust was a structure that could be built again. He did not ask about Daniel. He did not refer to Whitmore Global. Her past existed in the conversation only as the origin of her work, not as a narrative he needed to interpret. When they left the cafe, the city had shifted into late afternoon, the light turning the buildings into surfaces of gold and shadow. At the corner, they paused. I'll send a proposal, he said. Not for a partnership, for a pilot. You retain full design authority. We tested in 3 cities. If it fails under your terms. If it works, it belongs to your firm. Her firm, Equinox Cities. He had used the name without asking if it was real. How did you registered the domain 2 weeks ago, he said, almost apologetically. I do due diligence for a living. There was no intrusion in the statement, only respect for the existence of something she had not yet made public. He extended his hand, not to seal an agreement, to acknowledge a possibility. His handshake was steady, the pressure balanced, neither claiming nor retreating. As she walked back toward the train station, the wind lifting the edges of her coat, Ava felt something shift in the interior architecture she had built to survive exile. Not dependence, not relief, alignment. For the first time since the night she had been voted out of her own work, the future did not appear as a solitary construction. It appeared as a system that could include another mind without dissolving her own. In Detroit that night, she opened her laptop and reread the model for the Cleveland Coalition. For months, the document had been a structure built against absence. Now, in the margin of the first page, she wrote a single line, Pilot, 3 cities. Capital aligned to design. The words did not feel like hope. They felt like the return of a language she had once spoken fluently and then been forced to forget. Outside, the street lamp hummed, the parking lot empty under the slow fall of new snow. Inside, for the first time since exile had begun, Ava was no longer working only to prove that she could rebuild alone. She was working within the emerging possibility that the right ally did not reduce her power. He extended its reach without asking for its center. Spring in Detroit did not arrive all at once. It negotiated, a day of sun that made the river look almost forgiving, a night of cold that returned without apology. Sidewalks where snowmelt turned into small, reflective maps of a sky that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Ava learned to build in that kind of weather, not in the declarative rhythm of Washington. Announcements, launches, the choreography of visibility, but in a sequence of quiet, deliberate acts that accumulated into structure. The pilot with Julian began without a press release. 3 cities, Cleveland, Gary, Flint, names that had never appeared together in any investment deck she had once prepared. The first transfer of capital arrived on a Tuesday morning, marked not by ceremony, but by a notification in her banking app, and an attached memorandum that contained exactly one sentence in Julian's restrained handwriting. Design authority remains yours. She read it, then closed the message. For a long time, she did not move, not because of the money, because of the absence of conditions. No oversight committee that could override her framework. No advisory board populated by people whose primary qualification was proximity to influence. No requirement to translate the model into language that made it more comfortable for donors. Silence, the kind that allows work to exist in its original form. Her apartment changed first. The narrow table became a command center. Maps of municipal flood zones layered over demographic migration patterns. Budget projections annotated in her careful, slanted handwriting. The whiteboard she bought from a closing office supply store filled with equations that no longer had to be simplified for anyone else's understanding. She moved through the days with a discipline that felt almost monastic. 5:30 a.m., data review. 7 a.m., calls with city planners who spoke in the practical grammar of people who measured success in repaired roofs and functioning water systems. Afternoons, modeling capital deployment that prioritized continuity over speed. Evenings, writing the governance structures that would protect the work from being absorbed by the very systems it sought to change. There were no photographers, no panels, no language that needed to be persuasive, only architecture. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, she would stop and listen to the room, the soft whir of the laptop, the distant sound of traffic, the radiator, now mostly quiet in the warming weather. It was in those pauses that she realized how different this work felt. Not lighter, truer. In Washington, every decision had carried the invisible weight of narrative, how it would be framed, who would be credited, what it would signal to the networks that determined future access. Here, the only question was whether the model would function when the next storm came. Julian's presence in the project was almost spectral. He appeared in emails that contained precise, practical information, introductions to foundation officers who understood that their role was to enable rather than direct, legal frameworks that protected municipal autonomy, risk analyses that sharpened her projections without altering their premise. He never rewrote her documents. He never inserted himself into the calls. When they spoke, once a week at most, the conversations moved like two parallel systems exchanging data. How are the displacement curves adjusting? He would ask. Slower than expected, she replied one morning, watching the early light spread across the maps. Which means the recovery funds need a longer horizon. I'll restructure the capital schedule. No negotiation, no need to defend her reasoning. Trust, she realized, was not an emotion. It was a series of repeated actions that did not contradict themselves. The cities began to change, not dramatically, not in ways that would attract headlines. A neighborhood in Flint where the flood mitigation project included a clause requiring local contractors to be paid at rates that allowed them to remain in their own homes. A school in Gary whose insurance premiums dropped because the new infrastructure model altered the risk assessment. A municipal bond in Cleveland that, for the first time, included a metric for population continuity rather than property value alone. Small shifts, structural ones, the kind that altered the future without announcing themselves in the present. Word traveled, but in a different language than the one she had once known. Not through media, through planners calling other planners, through a mayor who sent a short message. We heard about what you did in Flint. Can we talk? Through a foundation officer who wrote, "This is the first model we've seen that doesn't treat us like branding partners." Ava did not respond immediately to any of them. She had learned the cost of speed. Instead, she built the internal systems that would allow Equinox cities to grow without losing its scent. Hiring protocols that prioritize lived experience in the cities they worked with. Governance charters that prevented capital from overruling community design. Contracts written in language that did not require translation to be understood by the people whose lives they would shape. At night, when the work paused, she walked. The river had shed its winter metal, moving now with a patient, steady current that reflected the lights of Windsor in long, trembling lines. She carried a small notebook in her pocket, not for data, but for the thoughts that came only when her mind was no longer occupied with numbers. Once, she wrote, "Visibility is not the same as impact. Silence is not the same as absence." She thought of the life she had left, the conferences, the applause that had followed her onto stages where her own work had been introduced under someone else's name, the way she had once measured progress by the density of her calendar. Now, days passed in which no one outside the system she was building knew what she was doing. And yet the system grew. One evening, late in May, she stayed in the apartment longer than usual. The windows opened to the first real warmth of the year. The model for the third city had just been finalized. On the screen, the projections held. Not perfectly, but with the kind of resilience that allowed for error without collapse. She leaned back and closed her eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would look like from the outside. A small firm in Detroit, no public profile, no visible founder in the media cycle. And yet, 3 cities whose futures had shifted because of a framework she had written at a narrow table in a room that had once felt like exile. Her phone vibrated. A message from Julian. The Cleveland Foundation wants to feature the project in their annual report. They're asking how you'd like to be credited. She stared at the screen. In her previous life, this would have been a negotiation, a decision calibrated for maximum strategic advantage. Now, the answer came with an ease that surprised her. Equinox Cities, principal architect, Ava Brooks. She sent it before she could reconsider. The name. Her name. Not as an appendage to a partnership, not as a footnote, as the origin. Outside, a siren moved through the city, its sound rising and falling like a reminder that this place, the one she had not chosen, the one that had received her without question, had become the ground on which she was building a future that no longer required an audience to exist. The silence that surrounded her work was no longer an emptiness. It was protection, a space in which the architecture could form without being reshaped by the expectations that had once defined her. In that silence, she was no longer reacting to what had been taken. She was constructing what could not be taken again. And in the steady accumulation of days that ended without applause, but with systems that held, Ava understood that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it grew in rooms where no one was watching, until the world had no choice but to recognize the structures that had been built there. It arrived on a morning that had no intention of being significant. Detroit was suspended in that brief, luminous interval between late spring and summer, when the air carried the scent of rain that had not yet fallen, and the light entered the room at an angle so clean it seemed almost deliberate. Ava was reviewing a zoning resilience matrix for Gary, the third revision, the one that would determine whether the insurance recalibration would hold through the next 5-year cycle, when her assistant, a former urban planning student who treated every document like a living thing, paused at the doorway. "There's something for you," she said, not an envelope in the administrative stack, not a contract, something separate, heavy paper, hand-delivered. Ava did not look up immediately. She finished the lines she was annotating, capped her pen, and then reached for it with the same measured movement she used for everything now. The envelope was thick, textured, the kind that existed not to carry information, but to establish gravity before it was even opened. Her name was written in black ink, not printed, not embossed, written, Dr. Ava Brooks. For a moment, she simply held. The room continued its quiet rhythm. The soft tapping of keys from the adjacent desk, the distant rumble of a passing truck, the low mechanical breath of the air conditioner adjusting to the heat. But the envelope carried a different atmosphere, memory, not the kind that arrived as images, the kind that altered the temperature of the body. She knew the handwriting, not because she had studied it, because for years it had appeared beside her own in signatures that had reshaped cities, capital flows, entire systems of language and power. Daniel Whitmore's. Her thumb traced the edge of the seal. The old instinct, the one that had once been trained to respond immediately, to anticipate the content, to strategize before the document was even opened, did not come. Instead, there was stillness, the deliberate stillness she had learned in exile. She broke the seal. The letter inside was brief. No preamble, no rhetorical architecture. An invitation. The Whitmore Global Climate Forum, Georgetown, September 18th, a 10-year anniversary summit, an event she had helped design before there had been a name for it, a gathering that had once been theirs. Her eyes moved to the final line. We would be honored if you would attend as our keynote speaker. Keynote, not panelist, not guest. The words sat on the page with the kind of quiet precision that altered the geometry of the room. For years, the keynote had belonged to Daniel, even in the projects she had built, even when the frameworks had been hers. She read the letter again, searching for the language that always existed beneath the visible text. The clause, the condition, the structure that redirected authorship. There was none. Only a handwritten note at the bottom. Your work has defined the field in ways we did not recognize soon enough. D.W. She folded the letter once. Not in rejection, not in acceptance, in containment. Outside, the sky had shifted into the color of impending rain. The office, Equinox Cities, though the sign had only been installed the week before, continued its day. Analysts moving between whiteboards. A call with Cleveland beginning in 20 minutes. The architecture she had built in silence, operating with the steady, unperformed competence that had become its language. This was not Washington. This was not the life in which an invitation from Whitmore Global would have rearranged the calendar, the priorities, the interior of her mind. And yet, Georgetown, the glass building on the river, the conference hall where she had once stood in the second row while Daniel delivered conclusions drawn from her work, the long corridor where she had received the email that turned her into an advisory role in the system she had built, the night she had walked out without being seen, a past that had existed not as nostalgia, but as a closed equation. Her assistant shifted slightly in the doorway. Do you want me to respond? Ava shook her head. Not yet. When the door closed, she leaned back in her chair and let the light move across the ceiling. The question was not whether to go. That would have been the old framework. The strategic calculus of presence, the evaluation of optics, the assessment of how attendance would be interpreted. The question was different. What did the invitation mean in a life that no longer required that room to define its legitimacy? Her phone vibrated. Julian, a single message. I assume you've received it. She smiled, despite herself. You read the foundation reports faster than I do. They called me last week for background. I told them to ask you directly. She stared at the screen. Do you have an opinion? She typed. The reply came after a pause that suggested he had considered the answer rather than selected it. Only this. The room is not the same room if you enter it as its origin rather than its extension. She set the phone down. Origin, not guest, not former partner, not symbol of reconciliation. The origin of a body of work that had continued to exist and evolve without Whitmore Global's name attached to it. She stood and walked to the window. Detroit in early summer was all movement, traffic threading through the streets, a group of children running through the spray of an open hydrant, a woman on the corner selling flowers from buckets that turned the gray pavement into a field of color, a life that had been built without the architecture of her past. The invitation did not threaten it. It did not complete it. It existed as a point on a map she had already redrawn. She remembered something Maya had said in those long months after the exile, when the past still had the power to rearrange her breathing. Closure is not the absence of memory. It is the absence of its authority. The letter lay on the desk behind her, white, uncompromising. A bridge extended not from the woman who had been erased, but toward the one who had rebuilt without asking for recognition. In the afternoon, the rain finally came, sudden, generous, striking the windows with a rhythm that filled the office with the sound of continuity. Ava returned to her desk. She did not answer the invitation. Instead, she opened a new document, not a speech, a framework. If she were to stand in that room again, she would not do so as a narrative. She would do so as an architect of systems that had been built in the absence of their approval. On the first line, she wrote, "Resilience as continuity, designing capital for the cities that were never meant to survive." The title did not belong to Whitmore Global. It belonged to the work she had done in Detroit, in Cleveland, in Gary, in Flint, to the cities that had never been invited into those rooms, to the version of herself that no longer needed to be seen to exist. Outside, The rain slowed into a fine, persistent mist. Inside, Ava folded the invitation once more and placed it in the drawer where she kept the notebook from her first winter in exile. Not hidden, not displayed, a document among the others that marked the coordinates of her life. The decision would come, not as reaction, as alignment, because the room that had once stopped her breathing was no longer the place where her story began. It was simply a space she could choose, or refuse, to enter, carrying a future that had been built far from its gaze. The morning she left for Washington, the city did not mark the departure. Detroit moved in its usual, generous indifference. Buses exhaling at corners, a delivery truck double parked beneath the Equinox City sign, sunlight sliding across the river like a sheet being pulled back. Ava packed with the precision of someone who no longer mistook preparation for control. One garment bag, one slim portfolio, the notebook that had traveled with her from the winter of exile. Nothing else. The dress she chose was not new. Midnight blue, cut with the same architectural restraint she applied to her models. No ornament, no visible effort to be seen. A line that held its own geometry whether anyone looked at it or not. At the airport, no one recognized her. The anonymity that had once been an absence had become a form of freedom. The ability to move through thresholds without carrying a narrative ahead of her. On the flight, she did not rehearse the speech. She watched the clouds. There had been a time when returning to Washington would have required the careful reconstruction of her former self. The posture calibrated for lobbies, the cadence that matched the acoustics of rooms where influence was measured by how quickly people turned their heads when you entered. Now, there was no version to retrieve, only the continuity of the woman who had built something that existed without that city's permission. When the car crossed the Key Bridge, the Potomac caught the afternoon light and held it in the same way it always had, a surface of moving silver, indifferent to the structures along its edge. Whitmore Global's building rose ahead, its glass facade unchanged, a monument to the narrative that had once defined her. For a moment, she saw the ghost of the woman who had walked out of those doors on a night that had smelled faintly of rain and polished marble. Coat unbuttoned, eyes fixed on a future she could not yet imagine. The memory did not hurt. It registered, like a landmark on a map that had been redrawn. Inside, the lobby still held the same temperature, a climate controlled for permanence. The same receptionist desk, though the face behind it was new. The same arrangement of light that made the floor appear to extend indefinitely. She gave her name. The recognition came not as shock, but as a ripple, a shift in posture, a second glance, the discreet transmission of information through an earpiece. Dr. Brooks, welcome back. Back. The word carried no authority. It described geography, not belonging. The elevator ride was silent. In the mirrored walls, her reflection did not resemble the one she remembered from years earlier. There was less urgency in it, less need to be interpreted. The conference hall had been redesigned, larger screens, a more fluid stage, but the essential architecture remained, rows of seats arranged in a gradient of importance. The central aisle that functioned as a corridor of visibility. She entered through a side door, not to avoid the gaze, because the room was already full. Foundation directors, policy architects, investors whose names had once determined the direction of entire sectors. Faces she knew. Conversations paused. Not dramatically, a slight delay in the rhythm of speech, a turning of shoulders, the recalibration of a room recognizing a presence it had not prepared for. She moved through it without altering her pace. Lucid, unhurried, the way she had learned to move through municipal offices in Flint and Gary, where presence was not negotiated but carried. At the front, Daniel stood near the stage, speaking with a cluster of board members. Time had altered him in small, precise ways. The line at the jaw softened, the hair threaded with silver. Not because she had arrived, because the equation that had once defined both of them no longer held. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. The look that had once contained partnership, ambition, shared authorship. Now, it held recognition, not of what had been lost, of what had been built separately. He stepped toward her. Ava, her name, spoken without the proprietary warmth that had once accompanied it. Daniel, the exchange was neutral, exact. There was a silence between them that did not require resolution. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I came to speak," she replied. No accusation, no reconciliation, a clarification of purpose. He nodded, the gesture carrying something like respect, the kind that emerges too late to alter the past, but in time to recognize the present. As she moved toward the stage, the room adjusted its attention, not to her dress, not to her return, to the fact that she carried a body of work that had redefined the field they all occupied. On the screens behind the podium, the title of her keynote appeared, "Resilience as Continuity, Designing Capital for the Cities That Were Never Meant to Survive." Not Whitmore Global's branding, not a co-authored initiative, her firm's name beneath it. Equinox Cities. The first slide was a map, not of global markets, of Cleveland, Gary, Flint, cities the room had never used as case studies. The murmur that moved through the audience was not dismissal. It was the recognition of unfamiliar territory. She did not begin with introduction. She began with data. Population retention curves, insurance recalibration metrics, municipal bond restructuring that prioritized continuity over asset appreciation. Her voice carried the same cadence it always had, calm, precise, but now it held no need to persuade. It presented a system that existed whether they approved of it or not. She spoke of displacement velocity, of governance models that embedded local authority into capital deployment, of impact measured not in returns alone, but in the survival of communities that had been written off as non-viable. As she spoke, the room leaned forward, not because she demanded it, because the architecture of her work required attention. In the third row, she saw a former colleague who had once corrected her language in meetings, now taking notes. In the back, a foundation director whose funding decisions had shaped her early career, watching with the stillness of someone recalibrating a long-held assumption. The power in the room had shifted, not through spectacle, through the quiet authority of a system that functioned. When she finished, the applause was not immediate. There was a pause, the kind that occurs when people understand that what they have heard will require them to change the way they work. Then it came. Not for her return, for the structure she had brought with her. Afterward, as people moved toward the stage, she stepped down and walked to the side exit, the same corridor she had once left through. Now, she moved through it without the urgency of escape. At the far end, she turned once. The room was visible through the glass, a field of conversation reorganizing itself around a model that had not existed there before. Daniel stood near the podium, speaking with a group of policy advisors, his posture altered, less the center, more a participant in a system he had not authored. Their eyes met across the distance. The return look, not of longing, not of victory, a recognition that the narrative that had once bound them had dissolved. She did not need the room to understand her. It had already happened. In Detroit, in the cities that had never been invited into this building. In the quiet architecture of Equinox Cities, she turned away and walked toward the exit, the glass doors opening with the same smooth motion they always had. Outside, the air carried the warmth of late summer. Washington continued its movement, unaware that for her, the return had not been about reclaiming a place. It had been about seeing it without the authority it once held. And as she stepped into the light, Ava understood that the look she had carried back into that room had not been for them. It had been for the woman who had once left it, to show her that nothing essential had ever been taken, only postponed until she could build it on her own terms. The panel was scheduled for late afternoon, the hour when conferences begin to lose their choreography. Coffee cools in untouched cups. Name badges tilt at tired angles. Conversations grow more honest because performance requires energy. It was not meant to be the central event. That had already happened. Her keynote, the data that rearranged the room, the quiet migration of attention that followed her down the corridor. This panel carried a different title: Scaling Resilience, Capital, Governance, in the Next Decade. 4 chairs on stage, 4 microphones, 4 people who, in another timeline, would have defined the architecture of her career. Ava arrived early, and took her seat without ceremony. From the stage, the room looked different than it had from the podium. Less like an audience, more like a network of systems, foundations, banks, policy units, each node connected to the others by capital, influence, and the shared language of risk. Daniel sat 2 chairs away. Between them, a representative from a sovereign investment fund whose models she had once rewritten in the margins of late-night documents. On her other side, a young climate tech founder, a woman who watched Ava with the particular focus of someone who had built her professional vocabulary using Ava's frameworks without ever having met her. The moderator began with the usual calibrations, acknowledgments, timelines, the promise of a dynamic exchange. For years, Ava had known this format intimately. Panels were theaters of controlled disagreement, each participant delivering rehearsed positions, the appearance of debate masking a prearranged equilibrium. But the room had already shifted. The keynote had changed the axis. The questions would not move in the old directions. The first one came from the moderator, addressed to Daniel. Whitmore Global has long been considered the leading architect of climate resilience investment. How do you see the field evolving over the next 10 years? The phrasing was careful, still rooted in the narrative that had once made him the origin. Daniel did not answer immediately. He glanced, briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Ava. Not for permission, for orientation. The field, he said finally, is moving toward models that center continuity over asset preservation, structures that we did not fully understand when we began. A small shift in language, not defensive, not performative, an acknowledgement of a changed map. And who is designing those models? The moderator asked. He did not hesitate. Dr. Brooks. The name moved through the room like a recalibrated equation, not as reference, as attribution. Ava did not look at him. She had learned that power was not confirmed through eye contact. It was confirmed through structure. The moderator turned to her. Your framework has been described as disruptive to traditional capital deployment. How do you scale something that resists the logic of scale? The question carried the old premise that scale was the ultimate validation. Ava folded her hands in her lap, the gesture small, deliberate. We stop measuring scale by volume, she said, and begin measuring it by continuity. Silence, not confusion. Attention, a system that allows a city to remain intact through 3 successive climate events has achieved scale, she continued, even if it does not expand geographically. The metric is not how far the model travels, it's how long the community survives. On the screen behind them, a graph appeared, not one of hers, but one of the moderator's prepared visuals. Traditional capital flows, asset appreciation curves, the language of the old order. She did not turn to it. She spoke into the space the room had become. The problem is not that capital moves too slowly, she said. It's that it moves without governance from the places it claims to protect. The sovereign fund representative shifted beside her. Institutional investors, he interjected, require standardized metrics. Without them, deployment becomes impossible. In another time, Ava would have translated her argument into his vocabulary, softened the edge, made it legible to the frameworks that determined access. Now she did not. Standardization, she replied, is a tool for distance. Governance is a tool for continuity. The young founder next to her leaned forward. We built our model using Equinox City's governance charter, she said, her voice clear. Our investors accepted it because the risk decreased when the community had decision rights. A ripple moved through the audience. Not applause, recognition. Data meeting, lived outcome. The sovereign fund representative turned toward Ava. Are you suggesting institutional capital should relinquish control? I'm suggesting, she said, that control without continuity is an extraction model. There it was, the language that had never been spoken on this stage. Not as accusation, as structural fact. Daniel watched her, not with the gaze of a former partner, with the attention of a participant in a system being redesigned. The moderator attempted to redirect. Whitmore Global has announced a new initiative aligned with these principles. Daniel raised his hand slightly. A small interruption. We are not aligning with these principles, he said. We are adopting them. The distinction landed with more force than any argument. Not adaptation. Adoption. The origin acknowledged. The power redistributed. In the audience, phones lifted. Notes were taken. But Ava felt none of the old acceleration, the pulse that had once accompanied recognition. This was not personal. This was structural. The young founder spoke again, her eyes moving between them. For my generation, she said, the question isn't who leads the field. It's who designs the systems we can survive in. The sentence altered the geometry of the stage. Leadership, the old vertical. Design, the new architecture. The moderator, sensing the shift, turned to Ava for the final question. If you could change one thing about the way this room deploys capital, she asked, what would it be? Ava looked out at the audience, at the faces that had once determined her visibility, at the institutions that had defined the language of impact. I wouldn't change the room, she said. I would change who the room answers to. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the recalibration of power. Afterward, as the panel ended and the audience rose in a movement that felt less like dispersal and more like reconfiguration, Daniel stepped toward her. Not close, close enough. You've redesigned the field, he said. No, she replied, gathering her notes. The field was always there. You just couldn't see it from where you were standing. He nodded. No defense, no attempt to reclaim authorship, only the recognition of a transfer that had already occurred. As she left the stage, the young founder caught her arm. Thank you, she said simply, for making it possible to build without asking permission. Ava smiled, not the composed smile of her former life, but the one that belonged to the woman who had built something in a room where no one had been watching. In the corridor outside, the light had shifted into evening. Through the glass walls, the city moved in its usual rhythm, unaware that inside this building, a system had been rewritten, not through spectacle, through language, through attribution, through the quiet moment when a name was spoken as the origin rather than the extension. And as Ava walked toward the exit, she understood that power had not changed hands in the way the old world described. It had changed structures, from ownership to authorship, from visibility to governance, from a single voice at the center to a system that could no longer exist without the communities it had once excluded. The panel had ended. The architecture had not. The reception that panel was held in the River Gallery, the same long room where, years earlier, Ava had learned to measure power by proximity. Glass walls, low light, conversations arranged in soft circles that function like gates. In the past, she had moved through these rooms with the precise calibration of someone who understood that influence was not announced. It was granted through repeated recognition. Now she entered without adjusting her pace. The air smelled of citrus and polished wood. Waitstaff moved with the discreet choreography that belonged to institutions convinced of their permanence. But the geometry of the room had shifted. Clusters formed and reformed around different centers. Around the young founder from the panel. Around a group of municipal leaders from the Midwest who had never before been invited to this building. Around Ava, not as spectacle, but as an axis. She accepted a glass of water and stood near the windows, the Potomac moving beyond the glass like a dark, patient system that required no acknowledgement to exist. For a while, the conversations that approached her were technical. Governance structures, deployment timelines, the legal architecture of advisory equity. No one asked about Daniel. No one spoke of the past. The narrative that had once defined her had dissolved into irrelevance. It was near the end of the evening when she saw the document. Projects on one of the side screens, part of the Foundation's 10-year retrospective. A timeline. Whitmore Global's milestones arranged in the familiar visual language of institutional memory. She might have ignored it, but there, in the section that covered the early resilience models, was the framework she had written. The displacement velocity index, the continuity metric, not attributed, not erased, rewritten. Whitmore Adaptive Risk Model, 2018. The room did not notice. Most people were facing the river, or the bar, or their own conversations. But for Ava, the projection altered the air, not the sharp fracture of the night she had been voted out. Something quieter, The realization that the old system still required its original architecture to remain intact, still required her work to exist under another name. For a moment, she simply watched it. Her first instinct, the one she had trained out of herself, did not come. No immediate confrontation. No need to correct, because she understood something now that she had not then. Disclosure was not accusation. Disclosure was structure. The moderator from the panel approached, following her gaze. "You should be proud," he said lightly. "That model changed everything." "Did it?" Ava asked. He looked again at the screen. At the name, a small hesitation. "The attribution process on those timelines is complicated." "Is it?" she replied. Her voice was not sharp. It carried the same tone she used when asking a city planner about budget allocations. Curiosity as a form of precision. Before he could answer, the lights in the gallery shifted. A brief request for attention. The foundation's director moved to the center of the room. "We want to close the evening," she said, "with a reflection on the work that brought us here. Another timeline, another narrative. But this time, the director's gaze moved toward Ava. 10 years ago," she continued, "this field began to change because of a framework that was not fully understood, even by the institution that deployed it." The room stilled. "Not in anticipation, in recalibration. We believed we were funding resilience," she said. "In reality, we were funding a model written by someone whose authorship we did not recognize." The screen behind her shifted. The old timeline dissolved. In its place, a document, a scanned page, Ava's handwriting. The original equations for displacement velocity, the margin notes she had written at 2 in the morning in a glass office that had no memory of her now. At the bottom of the page, A. Brooks, principal architect. A murmur moved through the room. Not shock, recognition. "This," the director said, "is the real origin of the field we are celebrating." Daniel stood across the gallery, his posture still, not defensive, witnessing. "For years," she continued, "we used the language of partnership to obscure authorship. Tonight, that changes." The document remained on the screen, unadorned. No institutional branding, only the work in its original form. Ava did not move. The disclosure was not dramatic. It did not carry the emotional force of a public confrontation. It was structural, a correction in the architecture of memory. People began to turn toward her, not with sympathy, not with the curiosity reserved for scandal, with the attention given to an origin that had been formally acknowledged. The sovereign fund representative from the panel approached first. "We built our risk models on this," he said quietly, looking at the document. "We never knew." "You knew the outcome," she replied. "That was enough." The young founder followed. "This is why we exist," she said. "Because you didn't let them define the model." Ava shook her head slightly. "I let them," she said, "at the time." The distinction mattered. Not a narrative of victimhood, a recognition of evolution. Daniel crossed the room then. The movement was unhurried. When he reached her, the document still glowed on the screen behind them. "I authorized it," he said, not as defense, as fact. "I know," she replied. "I should have done it years ago." Yes. No absolution, no accusation. The truth placed between them like a completed equation. He looked at the screen, then back at her. "You built the field," he said. "I built a model," she answered. The field built itself once it had the right architecture. There was nothing left to negotiate. Disclosure had done what confrontation never could. It had altered the structure in which their past existed. As the evening ended and people began to leave, the document remained on the screen, not as tribute, as correction. Ava stepped outside onto the terrace. The night air carried the humidity of late summer. The river moved in its steady, unbroken continuity. For years, she had imagined what it would feel like for the truth to be spoken in this building. She had imagined anger, vindication, a release. Instead, there was calm, because the disclosure had not given her something she did not already have. It had only aligned the institutional narrative with the reality she had built in exile. Behind her, through the glass, the document still glowed. Her handwriting, her name, not as an appendage, as origin. And in that alignment, she understood the final difference between the woman who had left this building and the one who stood on its terrace now. Then, she had needed the room to recognize her. Now, the room had adjusted itself to a structure she no longer required. The disclosure had not returned her power. It had confirmed that it had never truly left her hands. The gala ended in light, not the kind that warms, the curated glow of chandeliers and river reflections, but the precise, immaculate brightness institutions use to convince themselves they are eternal. Applause dissolved into music, music into polite departures into the soft, efficient dismantling of an evening that had altered the architecture of memory. Ava did not stay to watch it. She had learned that power rarely resided in the final moment of a room, but in the quiet that followed, when the narratives people had carried home began to rearrange themselves. Outside, Washington moved in late-night rhythm, black cars sliding along wet streets, the monuments at a distance holding their silent, ceremonial authority. Her car was waiting. She gave the driver the address of her hotel, and then, after a pause that surprised even her, asked him to stop 2 blocks before. She walked the rest of the way, not for distance, for air. The city smelled faintly of summer rain and old stone. At the corner, she passed a restaurant where she and Daniel had once celebrated the first investor commitment. The night they had believed themselves indivisible. The memory arrived without pain, like a photograph in a museum, preserved, contextualized, no longer inhabited. In her room, she removed her shoes and set the portfolio on the desk. The dress held its shape when she slipped out of it, the fabric remembering the geometry of her body, the way her models remembered the cities they had been built for. Her phone vibrated once. A message from Julian. The Foundation's board has voted. Full, multi-year deployment for the Equinox framework. No amendments. She read it twice. Not because she doubted it, because she understood the scale of what had just been confirmed. A structure she had built in exile now had the capital to move across an entire region without losing its center. She set the phone down. In the mirror across the room, her reflection stood in the soft hotel light, composed, unchanged. But the stillness inside her had shifted. Not triumph, not relief, completion. She did not notice Daniel's name on the screen until the second vibration. He did not call again. Instead, a message appeared. "May I see you?" She stared at it for a long time. Years earlier, that sentence would have rearranged everything. Her calendar, her breathing, the internal negotiation between anger and longing. Now, it existed as a simple question. She typed the room number. He arrived 10 minutes later. No security detail. No assistant. He stood at the door with the same posture he had once used when entering rooms that belonged to him. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that had altered. Not diminished, uncertain. She opened the door. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. The space between them held 10 years of shared architecture. The nights of drafting models side by side. The mornings of flights taken in parallel silence. The quiet rituals of a partnership that had once been indistinguishable from intimacy. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said. She stepped aside. He entered, stopping near the window as if the distance from her were a structure he did not yet know how to cross. "I wanted to speak before you left," he continued. She did not sit. Neither did he. The room held the neutral elegance of places designed for temporary inhabitation. "Everything you built," he said, "everything that was disclosed tonight, I knew it was yours." The sentence did not land as confession. It arrived as fact. "I know," she replied. "I told myself," he went on, his voice quieter now, "that the structure required a single face, that I was protecting the work by making it legible to capital. And in the process," she said, "you made me illegible." There was no accusation in her tone, only the completion of a thought. He closed his eyes briefly, as if the words had confirmed something he had spent years avoiding. "I thought we were indivisible," he said, "that what I did for the firm was what we did." "That was the myth," she answered. The word hovered between them. The power couple, the shared vision, the narrative that had allowed him to believe that authorship could be absorbed without consequence. "I lost everything when you left," he said. She looked at him, not with sympathy, With attention. Not the firm, he clarified. Not the capital. That continued. But the structure, the way the work formed in my mind when you were there, I've spent years trying to recreate it. His voice did not break. It thinned, like a system running on insufficient power. I brought in teams, he continued, consultants, entire divisions. They produced reports, strategies, but the architecture was never right. I kept thinking it was a matter of scale, of resources. It wasn't. He looked at her then, fully. It was you. The words did not function as flattery. They were a diagnosis of absence, of a structure that had depended on something he had not known how to name. You didn't lose me, she said. You moved me out of the center. He nodded. The movement small, almost imperceptible. I see that now. The room fell into silence. Not the strained silence of unresolved conflict. The quiet that follows the completion of an equation. I don't want to undo what you built, he said. I know that's not possible. I don't want to reclaim anything. I only wanted to say that I understand what I did. Understanding, not apology, not request. The collapse did not occur in his words. It occurred in the space around them, in the absence of the authority he had once carried, in the way he stood without the architecture of the firm to define him. For the first time since she had known him, he existed as a single individual, not the visible face of a system. Ava walked to the window. Below, the city moved with its late-night patience. I spent a long time believing that what we built together had been destroyed, she said quietly. It wasn't. It was misattributed. He did not answer. Exile taught me something, she continued. Architecture doesn't disappear when you remove the name from it. It waits for the right structure to hold it. She turned back to him. I didn't come here to return, she said. I came because the work needed to be spoken in the room where it began. And now? He asked. Now I leave. Not as departure, as continuity. He nodded again. The collapse was complete. Not a fall. A removal of the scaffolding that had once held his identity in place. Without it, he stood in the room as a man who understood, finally, the difference between visibility and origin. At the door, he paused. I loved you, he said. She met his gaze. I know. It was the truest thing they had ever said to each other, because it no longer required a future. When he left, the room returned to its neutral stillness. Ava sat at the desk and opened her notebook. On a blank page, she wrote a single line. Power is not the ability to remain in the same room. It is the ability to leave it without losing your architecture. Outside, the city continued its movement. Inside, the past had completed its final, private collapse. Not with noise, with recognition. The morning after the forum did not begin with headlines. It began with corrections. Quiet, precise, structural. In boardrooms where the air always smelled faintly of leather and long-term decisions, documents were opened that had not been reviewed in years. Attribution lines were rewritten. Governance clauses re-examined. The language of legacy frameworks replaced by something more exact, origin architecture. Whitmore Global's internal memo circulated at 6:10 a.m. Not a public statement, not yet. A reclassification of intellectual property. A restructuring of leadership authority within the climate division. Daniel's name remained on the partnership letterhead, but the division he had once stood at the center of was no longer vertical. It was reconfigured into a distributed governance model, a structure that required consensus with external municipal coalitions, most of which had already aligned with Equinox cities. Power had not been taken from him. It had been relocated into a system that no longer required a single visible axis. For the first time in the firm's history, the climate strategy meeting did not occur in the glass office. The room had been reassigned. Not to another executive, to a shared operations hub, a space with no central desk, no symbolic window. The architectural demotion was subtle enough to be described as collaborative restructuring. But everyone who had worked in that building long enough understood what it meant. Influence had moved elsewhere. Across the river, in a foundation headquarters that had once funded Whitmore Global's largest initiatives, a different meeting unfolded. The board voted to adopt the Equinox continuity metric as a requirement for all future resilience funding, not as a pilot. As policy, the old evaluation models, asset recovery timelines, investor visibility benchmarks were archived. A technical decision, a permanent one. In Cleveland, the mayor's office released a statement announcing the expansion of the Municipal Resilience Coalition into 5 additional cities. The document bore a single line of authorship: framework design, Equinox cities. No co-branding, no institutional appendage. In Gary, the insurance consortium recalibrated its national risk index based on Ava's displacement velocity model. The adjustment did not carry her name in the public announcement. It did not need to. The structure had already shifted. Capital now moved according to her architecture. By midweek, industry publications began to write the story, not as scandal, as transition, a new governance era in climate finance. From asset protection to community continuity, the Equinox model and the decentralization of resilience capital. Daniel was quoted. His language was careful, measured. He spoke of necessary evolution, of recognizing foundational contributions, of aligning with the future of the field. There was no mention of loss, because the consequence was not spectacle. It was redistribution. At Whitmore Global, the younger analysts began to speak differently in meetings, not deferring automatically to the head of the table, referencing Equinox models as the standard, using Ava's terminology without citation because it had already become the field's grammar. In one strategy session, a junior associate, someone who had once waited outside Ava's office for approval on a minor dataset, paused in the middle of a presentation and said, "This assumes asset continuity, not population continuity. That framework is no longer viable." The room adjusted, not to Daniel, to the structure of the argument. In the weeks that followed, invitations arrived at Equinox cities, not as requests for partnership, but as applications for alignment. Regional banks asking to adopt the governance charter. University research centers restructuring their climate programs around the continuity index. A sovereign fund proposing a deployment schedule that placed municipal councils in decision-making authority. Each proposal carried the same quiet acknowledgement. The field's center had moved. Ava read them in Detroit, at the same narrow table where the first pilot had been drawn. The office had grown, additional rooms, a staff that moved through the space with the focused energy of people who understood they were building something that would outlast individual careers. But her desk remained unchanged. The original whiteboard, the maps layered with annotations, the window overlooking the street where a new cafe had opened, its morning line extending past the door. One afternoon, a package arrived, not couriered through a legal office, delivered by hand. Inside was a small object, a glass nameplate from Whitmore Global's old climate division office, the one that had once read, "Daniel Whitmore, partner." The engraving had been removed, the surface polished to transparency. No note, no explanation, just the object that had once signified a center, now emptied of designation. She placed it on the shelf behind her desk, not as a trophy, as a reminder of how architecture could be reassigned without destruction. Julian noticed it on his next visit. "Closure?" he asked. "Consequence," she replied. He nodded, understanding the distinction. Closure belonged to emotion. Consequence belonged to systems. That evening, as the office emptied and the lights shifted into the soft gold of late summer, Ava walked through the workspace slowly, past the analysts reviewing municipal data, past the legal team drafting governance protections, past the wall where a map now marked every city operating under the Equinox framework. The map had begun as 3 points. It had become a network. Not global, intentional. Each connection representing a structure that could not be reversed without dismantling the entire field that now depended on it. She stopped at the window. Outside, Detroit moved with the steady continuity she had learned to trust. Buses arriving on time, the cafe closing its doors for the night, a couple walking past in the unself-conscious rhythm of a life that did not require recognition to be complete. The consequence arc had never been about Daniel, or Whitmore Global, or the room that had once determined her visibility. It had been about architecture, the inevitable realignment that occurs when origin is acknowledged and systems are rebuilt around it. No one had fallen. No empire had burned. But the axis had shifted so completely that the old structure could no longer function as it once had. Power had not been taken. It had been redefined. And in the quiet of the office that carried her firm's name on the door, not as symbol, but as operating system, Ava understood the final consequence. The field she had once struggled to be seen within now moved according to the principles she had written in exile. Not because she had demanded recognition, because the architecture had made every other model obsolete. Autumn arrived in Detroit with a kind of light that did not ask to be admired. It rested on the edges of buildings, turned the river into a slow-moving mirror, settled on the windows of Equinox cities, as if it had always known where the center would be. Inside, the office no longer carried the quiet improvisation of its early days. It had become an organism. Maps that once marked 3 pilot cities now stretched across an entire wall. Cleveland, Gary, Flint, Toledo, Buffalo, Milwaukee. Each point connected not by ambition, but by continuity. Colored threads traced capital flows that no longer descended from a single source, but moved laterally, municipally, governed by the people who lived inside the systems they were funding. Ava stood in front of that wall in the early morning before anyone else arrived. This had become her ritual, not to measure growth, to remember origin. The first winter table. The radiator that spoke in metal sighs, the silence that had once felt like absence and revealed itself as protection. Her reflection in the glass beside the map was steady, unhurried. There was no longer a question of whether the field recognized her. The field operated in her language. The municipal bond frameworks carried her continuity metric as standard. University programs taught the Equinox Governance Charter as foundational theory. Investment committees. The same institutions that had once required her to translate her work into something smaller now sent delegations to Detroit to understand how to restructure themselves. Not to acquire, to align. Julian entered without knocking, as he always did. "There's a call from Sao Paulo," he said, setting a folder on her desk. "They want to build the first continuity-based model in South America." She smiled, not at the scale of it, but at the familiarity of the request. "Tell them we'll listen," she said, "not lead." It had become the firm's first principle. Equinox did not expand. It connected. An empire, not of territory, but of architecture. Later that afternoon, the team gathered in the main room, not for an announcement, not for a celebration, but for the weekly systems review that had replaced the performance of success. A young analyst from Flint presented the data on post-flood population retention, 92%, a number that would never appear on a global stage, never be quoted in a keynote, but which contained more power than any valuation Ava had once helped Daniel secure. When the meeting ended, the room dissolved into smaller conversations, the hum of work continuing without the need for her at the center. That had been the final transformation. The system no longer required her constant presence. She walked to her office and opened the drawer where the old Whitmore nameplate lay. The glass plate that had once signified a single visible authority. She lifted it, turned it so it caught the light. Transparent. A structure emptied of its former meaning. She placed it beside the original notebook from her exile. 2 artifacts, one of removal, one of origin. The empire she had built did not resemble the one she had once imagined. There was no tower, no central office in a capital city, no stage from which she spoke as the face of a movement. It existed in municipal chambers, where residents voted on their own flood mitigation plans, in insurance policies that no longer forced families to leave after a single climate event, in classrooms where students studied continuity not as theory, but as inherited reality, power that did not need to be seen to function. That evening, she walked along the river. The air carried the crispness of approaching winter, but the water moved with the same patient certainty it had held in every season of her transformation. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "My name is Lila. I'm a civil engineering student in New Orleans. We're using your model to rebuild our coastal district. I just wanted you to know we're still here because of it." Ava stopped walking. "Read the message again." not as validation, as continuation. She typed a reply and then paused. Not because she did not know what to say, because she understood that this was the real measure of what she had built. Not recognition, not even consequence, survival. She wrote, "You were always the center. We just built the system around you." The river moved. The city lights came on one by one, reflections forming a network across the surface of the water. An empire, not of ownership, of endurance. When she returned to the office, the building was quiet. Only the soft glow of desk lamps where a few team members still worked, their focus undisturbed by her presence. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, this structure that no longer depended on her name to exist. Then she turned off the light in her office and paused, her hand resting briefly on the doorframe that bore the simple lettering, Equinox Cities. No title beneath it, no hierarchy, just the architecture. And for the first time since the night she had been erased from a narrative that could not contain her, Ava allowed herself a small, unguarded smile. Because this continuity, this field that moved without asking permission, was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of thousands of others. Stories in cities that would never know her face, communities that would never speak her name, systems that would continue long after she stepped away from the map. If you have ever been told that your work was too quiet to matter, too precise to be seen, too independent to belong, remember this. Power is not the room that excludes you. It is the world you build when you walk out of it. And if this journey from erasure to origin, from exile to architecture, has stayed with you, then stay with us. Because there are more stories like this, more empires built in silence, more women who are not returning to the old rooms. They are designing new ones. Follow the path, share the story, and tell me, where in your life are you still waiting for permission when you could be building your own continuity?